Chapter 21. Carlos was sitting with his back to the door eating fruit cocktail out of a can when he heard Jill stir, the regular, consistent sound of her deep breathing becoming lighter. She turned her head from side to side, still asleep, but the movement was the most deliberate action he'd seen in 48 hours. He stood as quickly as he could, forced to be careful by the pinch of his tightly taped ribs, and hurried to the raised altar where she lay. He picked up a bottle of water at the base of the dais, and when he stood up again, she opened her eyes. "Jill, I'm going to give you some water now. Try and help me out, okay?" She nodded, and Carlos felt sappy with relief, holding her head up while she drank a few swallows from the bottle. It was the first time she had responded clearly to anything, and her color looked good. For 2 days she had drunk when he pushed it on her, swallowing at least, but as white as a ghost and completely out of it otherwise. "Where are we?" Jill asked weakly, closing her eyes as she lay her head back down on the makeshift pillow, a piece of rolled-up carpet. Her blanket was made from unburnt drapes he'd salvaged from the foyer. "The chapel at the clock tower," he said softly, still smiling. "We've been here since the helicopter crashed." Jill opened her eyes again, obviously aware and reasonably focused. She wasn't infected. He'd been so afraid for a while, but she was okay. She had to be. "How long?" Talking seemed to be tiring for her, so Carlos tried to summarize everything that had happened, to save her the questions. "The Nemesis shot down the helicopter, and you and I were both wounded. Your shoulder was injured, but I've been changing the dressings, and it doesn't seem to be infected. We've been here 2 days, recuperating. You've been sleeping mostly. It's October 1st, I think. The sun set an hour ago, and it's been raining on and off since last night." He trailed off, not sure what else he could tell her, but not wanting her to fall asleep again. Not right away. He'd been stuck with his own thoughts for long enough. "Oh, I found a case of fruit cocktail, of all things, in the trunk in that one sitting room. The one with the chessboard, remember? Water, too. Someone was hoarding, I guess. Lucky for us. I didn't want to leave you alone. I've been, taking care of you." He didn't add that he'd been cleaning her up, changing the drapes she lay upon when it was necessary. He didn't want her to feel embarrassed. "You're hurt?" she asked, frowning, blinking slowly. "Couple of fractured ribs, no big deal. Well, maybe when I have to pull the tape off, that's gonna hurt like a son of a bitch. All I could find was duct tape." She smiled faintly, and Carlos softened his tone, almost afraid to ask. "How are you doing?" 2 days? No more helicopters?" she asked, looking away, and he felt himself tense slightly. She hadn't answered his question. "No more helicopters," he said, and noticed for the first time that the color in her cheeks was overly red. He touched the side of her neck, and his tension grew. Fever, not too bad, but she hadn't had it the last time he'd checked, an hour before. "Jill, how do you feel?" "Not bad. Not bad at all. Hardly any pain." Her voice was flat, infectionless. Carlos smiled crookedly. "Bien, see? That's good news. That means we can pack up and get out of here soon." "I'm infected with the virus," she said, and Carlos froze, his smile fading. No, she's wrong. It's not possible. It's been 2 days. You can't be," he said firmly, telling her what he'd been telling himself since he first woke up. "I saw one of the other soldiers turn into a zombie. Couldn't have been more than 2 hours from the time Randy was bit until he changed. If you have it, something would have happened by now." Jill carefully rolled onto her side, wincing a little, closing her eyes again. She sounded incredibly tired. "I'm not going to argue with you, Carlos. Maybe it's a different mutation because it came from the Nemesis, or maybe I picked up some kind of immunity from being at the Spencer estate. I don't know, but I have it." Her voice shook. "I can feel it. I can feel myself getting worse." Okay, shh," Carlos said, deciding that he would leave immediately. He'd take Jill's revolver in addition to the assault rifle, and definitely a couple of hand grenades. The hospital was close, and there was at least one vaccine sample there. That's what Trent had said. Carlos had wanted to find the hospital earlier for supplies, but he'd been too exhausted and hurt to go looking. At first, and then he hadn't wanted to risk leaving Jill alone and unconscious. Dangerous for several reasons. "I'll go out front and head west, see if I can find a sign of something." Trent had also said something about the hospital not being there for much longer. Carlos hoped he wasn't too late. "Try and get back to sleep," Carlos said. "I'm going to take off for a while, to try and find something that might help you. I won't be gone long." Jill already seemed to be half asleep, but she raised her head and made an effort to be clear, enunciating carefully. "If you come back and I'm sicker, I want you to help me. I'm asking you now. I may not be able to ask you later. Do you understand?" Carlos wanted to protest, but knew that he'd want the same thing if he had a disease. Being dead sucked, but Raccoon was proof that there were worse things. "Like having to shoot someone you care about." "I understand," he said. "You rest now. I'll be back soon." Jill slept, and Carlos started to load up. Just before he left, he gazed into her sleeping face for a long moment, silently praying that she'd still be Jill when he got back. The hospital turned out to be much closer than he thought, less than 2 blocks away. Nikolai waited for Ken Franklin eagerly, knowing that the watchdog's death would mark the beginning of the endgame. Nikolai's growing frustration was about to come to an end. If the bastard ever shows up. But no, he was coming, and then Nikolai would be on track again. He checked the corner window of the office he'd chosen, overlooking the dark, empty street, also his escape route if the sergeant turned out to be troublesome. For the 10th time in half as many minutes, willing the errant watchdog to hurry. Nothing had gone as he'd planned, and although he'd made the best of it, Nikolai was losing his patience. The search for Davis Chan had been spectacularly unsuccessful. Nikolai hadn't even caught a glimpse of him during the 2 days he'd stayed in the city. And twice more, the elusive soldier had managed to avoid a confrontation after filing his reports, sending Nikolai running all over town. Nikolai had also been planning to head to Umbrella's water treatment facility to get rid of Terrence Foster earlier in the day, but he'd been further sidetracked in a wild goose chase. He'd seen an uninfected woman near the RPD building, a tall Asian-American woman wearing a tight, sleeveless red dress and holding a gun like she knew what to do with it. She'd slipped into the building and was gone. Nikolai had searched for nearly 4 hours but hadn't seen the mystery woman again. So, all 3 of his targets still alive. He'd been able to collect some watchdog information at least, uncovering a couple of private lab reports on the strength of the average zombie. But he'd had enough. Enough eating cold beans out of cans, enough sleeping with one eye open, enough playing big game hunter. By his count, he'd killed 4 beta hunters, 3 giant spiders, and 3 brain suckers. And dozens of zombies, of course, although he didn't really count those as worthy of note. Not anymore. They just kept getting slower and stickier. Raccoon already smelled like a giant cesspool, and it was only going to get worse as the virus carriers continued to decay, turning into great, sludgy piles of malodorous stew. I'll be gone by then. After all, Franklin will be here in a minute. After 2 days of unmet objectives, Nikolai had come to see Franklin's appointment at the hospital as something solid, something he could hold on to, a sure kill. And as he passed long, solitary hours immersed in the growing chaos of uncertainty, the death of Ken Franklin had become extremely important. Once he was dead, Nikolai could blow up the hospital. Once the hospital was destroyed, Nikolai could hunt down Chan and Foster, and then he could leave. Everything would fall into place as soon as he killed Franklin. Even as Nikolai embraced that thought, he heard footsteps out in the hall. Heart swelling with pleasure, Nikolai took his position by the window and waited for Franklin to find him. The cluttered office supply room was on the 4th floor, not far from where he'd killed and hidden Dr. Equino. Come along, Sergeant. When the watchdog opened the door, Nikolai was leaning casually in the corner, arms folded. Franklin was carrying top of the line, a 9mm VP-70, and he had it trained on Nikolai's face in the blink of an eye. Nikolai didn't move. You're not supposed to be here, Franklin said coolly, his voice deep and deadly. He stepped further into the room, not taking his gaze, or the semi-automatic, off of Nikolai. Time for him to find out who's smarter. Anyone could stage an ambush, but it took a certain amount of intelligence and skill to make one's opponent willingly walk into one. Nikolai feigned a mildly surly nervousness.
You're right. I'm not. Aquino should be here, but he stopped filing reports yesterday. They thought he was too busy working on the antiviral, but I've been looking since last night and can't find him.
Nikolai had actually filed several status reports with Dr. Aquino's name on them since killing him, to keep up appearances.
Who are you?
Franklin asked. He was tall and well-muscled, with very dark skin and rather delicate-looking wire-rimmed glasses. There was nothing delicate in the way he looked at Nikolai, however. Nikolai uncrossed his arms and lowered them very slowly.
Nikolai Dinovov, UBCS, and Watchdog. I was tapped to check things out when the doctor went AWOL. You're Franklin, right? Have you had any contact with Aquino since your arrival? Did he talk to you about where he was going to secure the sample? Or give you a combination or a key?
Franklin didn't lower his weapon, but he was obviously confused. Nobody told me about any change in plans. Who did you say sent you? This part was a risk. Nikolai knew the names of 4 men important enough to have made changes to Umbrella's agenda, and chances were good that one of them was Franklin's contact and would already have informed Franklin.
I didn't say, Nikolai said, but I guess it's okay to tell you. Trent called me in on this.
He'd chosen the man he knew least about, even after all his careful research, in the hope that Franklin wouldn't know anything about him either. Trent was an enigma, skulking around the other top brass like some cryptic shadow. Nikolai didn't even know his first name. It worked for the sergeant. Franklin lowered his weapon, still weary, but obviously willing to believe. So you couldn't find Aquino? What about the vaccine? Nikolai sighed, shaking his head, then deliberately looking to his left, a space hidden from Franklin's view by an overstuffed shelf.
No sign of the doc, but this was in his office. And there's a wall safe back here. Do you know anything about getting one of these things open?
Nikolai knew that Franklin did, on his personnel file. Safe cracking was listed among his skills. Nikolai didn't give a shit whether or not Franklin could open the safe. What mattered was that to get to the safe, the sergeant would have to turn his back on Nikolai.
I'm better at this than Aquino or Chan or this fool, and this will prove it. I'd never turn my back on anyone, ever.
Yes, that would be unworthy of him. Franklin nodded, holstering the VP-70 and walking toward the corner where Nikolai stood. Yeah, I know a little. I can take a look at it anyway. Nikolai nodded briskly.
Good. I was starting to think that I was going to be stuck here for a while.
Maybe that's for the best, Franklin said, stepping past Nikolai to a small safe inset behind the shelf. But the way things are going out there, I've been thinking about hauling up someplace for a while, waiting until things die down a little. Nikolai took a silent step closer to Franklin, eyeing the VP-70's unsnapped holster.
Not a bad idea.
Franklin nodded, frowning at the keypad. Chan is doing it. He says the info will still be there tomorrow, so why not, right? Davis Chan. Nikolai held very still, deciding, and then he darted forward and snatched up the 9mm, not wanting to dance for what he wanted. He shoved Franklin at the same time, pushing him off balance, using the split second of his recovery time to sight the heavy handgun. Chan, tell me where he is, and you live, Nikolai barked. With his free hand, he reached into his pocket and touched the vaccine case for luck. It had become something of a talisman for him, a reminder of how good he was, and it was lucky. He knew it.
Franklin and now Chan, the only 2 watchdogs with no assigned filing locale. Incredible.
Franklin backed up a step, hands up. Hey, take it easy.
Where is he?
Franklin was sweating. At the radio setup, okay? At the cemetery. Look, I don't know you, and I don't care what you're doing.
Terrific,
Nikolai said, and shot Franklin in the abdomen twice. Franklin grunted heavily as blood splattered the wall behind him. The sergeant fell backwards and landed on his butt, arms still outspread, an expression of surprise on his dark features. Nikolai was a little surprised himself. He'd expected better from one of the soldier dogs. Nikolai raised the weapon, aiming it at Franklin's forehead, when he heard the door open, footsteps jogging into the room. Handgun still pointed at the dying Franklin, Nikolai ducked down and peered through an opening in the shelf, and saw Carlos Oliveira standing there, staring around wildly and hefting a .357 revolver, obviously trying to figure out where the shots had come from. It was a gift from the fates. Nikolai stepped into view, Carlos's stupid face targeted before the soldier even realized that there was somebody else in the room. "Gotcha," Nikolai whispered.